Shalom and welcome to the One Pasuk podcast, where the rabbis at Congregation Avas Torah each share an insight on one particular pasuk from the Parsha and reflect on each other's ideas. Rabbinic banter, I like to call it. I am Chaim Pupko, and I am joined by my dear friends and teammates, Rabbi Daniel Goldberg
Shalom.
And Rabbi Morty Kisus.
Shalom.
If you'd like to sponsor an upcoming episode, please contact the shul. All right, here we go. The one pasuk for this week, Parshas Vaeschanan, comes to us from Perek Daled, Pasuk Tes, chapter 4, verse 9. Rak hishamer lecha ushmor nafshecha ma'od. You should be very careful. Watch yourselves. Pen tishkach es hadvarim asher ra'u einecha, lest you forget that which you saw. Moshe Rabbeinu is reviewing the event of Ma'amad Har Sinai, the experience of the revelation at Sinai, the giving of the Torah, and he's warning them they should not forget what they saw. Ufen yasuru milvavcha kol yemei chayecha, and let it not fade from your hearts all your days. V'hodatan levanecha ulevanecha, and you should tell your children and your children's children about everything that you saw at the giving of the Torah. Who's leading off?
I wanted to take this opportunity to share a halacha. The pasuk says, "Hishamer lecha ushmor nafshecha me'od." There's a Gemara in Masechet Berachot that tells a story of a Hasid Ehad, a pious man that was traveling on the way and had to pray. So he stopped on the side of the road and began to pray. And a very aristocratic individual was passing and greeted him, but he was in the middle of the Amidah, so he didn't respond. And the man understood that he was praying to God, so he waited. And then, considering the fact that he was a prince, he was a very powerful individual, he looked at him and said, "You fool, you insulted me by not responding to my greeting. I could have beheaded you, and you couldn't have done anything about it." And he said, "Let me just explain it to you with a mashal." He said, "You are around aristocrats. You live in a very high society. You understand what it's like when you're in the presence of someone far greater than you." And the pious man asks this prince, if you were talking to a melech basar v'dam, a human king, and somebody came your way, would you respond to the greeting if somebody interrupted your conversation? And he said, "Of course not." He said, "Let's say you did. What would happen?" He said, "I would have been beheaded." So he said, "I'm talking to the kings of kings, melech malchei hamelachim." Now the Gentile, the prince, was very educated because he was capable of quoting not one but two pisukim to prove to the man that what he's doing was foolish. First, he told him, "Hishamer lecha." This pasuk in our parasha, that the pasuk tells us that we're supposed to protect ourselves. Hishamer lecha ushmor nafshecha me'od. And he also quoted the more famous pasuk, Ushmartem me'od lenafshotechem. That was his argument. His argument was, how could you not be careful? How could you not watch out for yourself? By you being so focused on your prayer and ignoring my greeting, it could have resulted in your death. And the man's response was this mashal that he gave him about the melech basar v'dam, about a human king. Now, just recently, someone reached out to me and told me that since October 7th, I go to Minyan almost every single day, except for very rarely when I travel. It moved me to the extent that I recognized I have to start praying. And he said, I almost never miss, but I don't feel connected to tefillah. And he asked me if we can sit and just go over some of the basics. And I told him one of the most important kavanot that you have to have is when you stand up to say the Amidah, to recognize that I'm standing before God. It's not necessarily to concentrate on the words. Even prior to that, you have to understand that when you're standing in the Amidah, everyone around you cannot be considered. You have to be so focused on your Amidah and understand that you're speaking to God, Melech Malchei HaMelachim HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that you ignore everyone like this Hasid in the story. To some, we think, I want to pray better, but it's way too complicated. There's so much that it entails. I don't speak Hebrew well. It's too difficult to understand the commentaries on tefillah, and so I won't do anything. Here's an easy way to enhance your prayer by merely having kavanah, that prior to standing up to say the Amidah, just one thought, I am now standing before God, and then you begin your Amidah, as we see from this pasuk of Hashem, Hishamer lecha ushmor nafshecha me'od.
I really find that that's the most powerful part of my davening, like when I actually kind of get into the moment, take a deep breath and just say, I'm standing before God. Just that sincere reflection in that moment is like, that's the ball game for me, for my davening. It resets, like, oh, I'm a servant of God, and there's a God, and like all the things that are on my plate that I'm struggling with and concerned about, like, it's like a GPS. It like kind of like geolocates me, like, oh, I'm here and there's God, and like, oh, okay, it's so like profoundly anchoring, just that one moment of like sincere, like, I'm standing before God. So it resonated very much.
Which is why it's so powerful, the custom that we learned even as small children, that you take 3 steps forward to begin your Amidah. The 3 steps forward is to feel that you are entering the presence of Hashem. And our rabbis give us these tools and they give us these reminders to physically express that which we're trying to cultivate within.
I'll pivot us to a slightly different focus in this pasuk. As the rabbi mentioned in his introduction, the pasuk describes a responsibility that we have to recall the experience of Har Sinai, to recall that which we saw at Har Sinai. The Rambam does not count this as one of the Taryag mitzvos, neither a positive commandment nor a negative commandment, not to forget or to remember. The Ramban, however, does. He counts this as one of the Taryag mitzvos, and an obligation that is incumbent upon us to recall the experience of Har Sinai. It's interesting, why don't we have like we read for Zechiras Amalek, right? We have an annual reading where we fulfill this mitzvah, so maybe it's because that is to remember, this is not to forget, so it's not a positive command. And there's lots to think about here. The Ramban explains the significance of this mitzvah from a theological, very fundamental, I would say fundamental of faith perspective, that unlike other faiths that rely on the word of a particular prophet that describes the revelation of God, all of the Jewish people had the revelation at Har Sinai, and that firms up our belief. It's on a different level because this was a mass revelation. It's not something that we have to rely on an individual for, and that gives it so much more power, and it prevents it from being undermined by another person coming along and saying, oh, well, God told me that actually this, that, and the other thing. So it has the kind of theological implications. But I also just think, kind of taking a step back and making a rather simple observation here, the fact that it's not just the content of Har Sinai that matters. It's not just the Torah that we received, but it's the experience of it. What did it feel like? What did we learn from the environment that God created in that moment? It's just a very profound reminder to us that in life, it's not just, how we present things. It's not just how halacha is observed in our home. It's what is the environment in our home? What does it feel like? What does it feel like to go to school? What does it feel like to be in shul? What does it feel like? Is it aesthetically beautiful? Is it enjoyable? Is there an avirah, an environment of joy? Those less concrete dimensions of things really, really matter. And we have a mitzvah to remember what it felt like to be at Har Sinai, not just what was said at Har Sinai. I think that's an important point.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it definitely speaks to our generation, which focuses a little bit more on the experiential, on how people engage with Jewish practice and the experience that they have when they do it, as opposed to earlier generations, which perhaps showed more commitment just by showing up and by doing no matter what. But you see, long ago in our tradition, this idea embedded that the experience and not just the content is critical. I always like to refer to Ma'amad Har Sinai as this divine laser light show. They saw fantastic things, and the pasuk refers to them specifically. And them seeing those things is not incidental. It's critical to the medium that goes along with the message.
Yeah. And the first mission in Avos is Moshe Kibel Torah Misinai. And there's a lot to unpack in those words, but what does it mean? He received it from Sinai, he received it from Hashem, but part of what Moshe received was actually the Sinai experience. There was something awesome about Sinai. And I think that also, maybe it also reminds us that as much as we have available in books and online in the way of Torah, there's certain things that, or even like, over Zoom, right? There's something that about being in the room and having the experience, rather than just what's on the paper.
Yeah. So the Abarbanel has a comment that this pasuk comes after Moshe states that the mitzvos should be observed because they're important, because they enhance our lives. And then Moshe says, but also don't forget the experience of receiving those mitzvos, because there may come a time when you think, especially when it comes to mishpatim, especially when it comes to mitzvos that are intuitive, that we might have thought of on our own. So you might think that you're fulfilling these mitzvos because they make sense. You might forget, or you might not think about that these are also divinely ordained mitzvos. So that don't steal and don't murder. Almost every society has that notion, and to follow those mitzvos doesn't necessarily feel like I'm following the will of Hashem. But if we forget that every mitzvah comes from Hashem, we risk not recognizing that they come from a higher power and that they have an absolute applicability. When mitzvos feel humanly given, it's much easier to make exceptions and to apply them in different ways. But when you see them as divinely ordained, as coming from Hashem, then you see them as much higher, elevating mandates that cannot be compromised. And I think this is such an important idea because, especially in the technological age that we live in, it's hard to feel Hashem's imminent presence, but there are different ways to remind us that we are in the presence of Hashem and that we have a connection to Hashem and Hashem is involved in this world, whether it's through tefillah, like Rabbi Kesus mentioned, or whether it's the way Rabbi Goldberg was describing about employing that experiential element. We have to remind ourselves, we have to reinforce for ourselves that these are divine mandates, and these divine mandates give us a higher calling, and that we live our lives in a way that represents the values that Hashem wants to see in this world.
Which actually reminds me of a question that you just asked recently, Rabbi Pupko, at a Shiva house that we were at together. You asked why the introduction to Pirkei Avot appears where it does. Moshe kibel Torah Sinai Msara Yoshua v'Yishua l'Zkenim. You would imagine that if we're trying to give the tradition of how the Torah was given, it should appear at the very beginning of Masechet Berachot, in the first Mishnah, the first Perek, the first Masechet, the first anything. By the way, this is where the Torah comes from. But yet, it appears at the end of Seder Nezikin, which is just an introduction to Pirkei Avot. It's really to hammer home this point, and that is that Moshe kibel Torah Sinai Msara Yoshua is an introduction to Pirkei Avot, which is primarily about midot and character traits and interpersonal relationships. It's not necessarily about our relationship with God. We take the Torah and we tell you that no, the Torah is going to help you develop your character, and the Torah is going to tell you what's appropriate. Very often we lean on, other experts of etiquette and relationships to give us what's correct and what the Torah may recommend. No, the Torah has everything in it, including how we are to relate to others. It's the ultimate book of advice. It's the ultimate guiding principles for us listed here. And so specifically in the introduction to Pirkei Avot, it says, Moshe kibel Torah Sinai Msara Yoshua. Even these Mishnayot that are going to discuss character is actually also directly from the Torah.
Thank you all so much for listening. We hope you enjoyed. If you're interested in sponsoring a future episode, please reach out to one of us. And of course, please send us your feedback. Shabbat Shalom and Good Shabbos from the One Pasuk Podcast.